If you've been feeling like you live 2 states further north lately, there's a good reason. We've had a very unusual weather pattern, and our garden out here in Stillwater looks that way also. We want to take a look at some of our warm season vegetables in this raised bed garden. We have planted here purple eggplant, tomatillos, and purple sweet potatoes, and even though they were planted about 3 weeks ago, they're just sitting there, not growing, not really looking very healthy. And the reason for that is the soil temperature has been very cool and wet. And when that occurs, any of the warm season vegetables are either going to rot if they're in the seedling stage, and I'll show you some of those later on, or they're just going to sit there and not grow at all. And the reason for that is that the fruiting plants that we grow for the summertime, whether it's squash or beans or tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, they all originated in the tropics, in warm conditions. And when you have a springtime like we've had and plant them in the garden, they're really not going to do very much. And there's not a lot you can do for these eggplant right now. You can't feed them. You could cultivate the soil a little bit, but there is a group of plants that are doing tremendously well that I want to show you, and that's in our cool season garden. Our purple vegetable garden is thriving in these cool temperatures. Broccoli, onions, cauliflower, cabbage, all originated in much cooler climates than the warm season crops we were just talking about. And take a look at this violet queen cauliflower. It doesn't need blanching. In fact, the more light it has, the deeper purple that will be. It's a beautiful plant and it's doing very well right now. We have a nice mix of purple cabbages, and now on all of these you're going to want to keep an eye out for any insect damage that occurs. Watch for various caterpillars. They're going to chew holes in the foliage. If it gets too serious, you're certainly going to need to dust it with something containing Bacillus thuringiensis. That will help control any caterpillars feeding on them. Now the red onions that we have are doing extremely well in the cool, wet weather. Beautiful color. That's going to be great on a hamburger in a few weeks. Take a look down here at some of our purple sprouting broccoli. And this is also thriving in the cool temperatures. We've seen very little insect damage, and I think a lot of that is because we've had so much rain and cool weather. They've been growing extremely fast and have nice, tough foliage. Now let's take a look at our favorite home garden vegetable and see how a little bit of TLC can put you way ahead in the garden. Well, Steve and Alan have really pulled out the stops to make sure they get tomatoes this summer. They've run a 100-foot electrical cable out to this raised bed garden and plugged it into a soil heating cable to make sure the roots of these tomatoes stay warm. And let me show you some other things that they've done here. They have them in cages now, but a few weeks ago, when these were planted in February, they had walls of water around each tomato. So the soil was being kept warm by the cable. The walls of water kept the air temperature moderated around the plants. Since then, they've put up giant tomato cages and nice stiff stakes because it is very windy here in Stillwater. And as you can see, the plants are thriving. They're doing extremely well. Checking the soil temperature, it's about 80 degrees versus 65 degrees back over at that eggplant we were looking at. Some other things they've done in this bed to ensure a good harvest of tomatoes is they've done what's called undersowing. This is a method that a lot of market gardeners in the New England states have started doing to make sure that they get adequate nitrogen throughout the growing season. Subclovers are going to get about 4 to 6 inches tall, so they're not going to compete with the growth of these tomatoes, but they have many benefits. Being a legume, they're going to release a small amount of nitrogen throughout the growing season, especially if they are cut down and worked in later in the summer. Another advantage of subclovers is they act as a living mulch, keeping the soil cool and moist through the summer, and you know in the heat of August, high soil temperatures are going to be a problem. They also prevent mud from splashing up on the tomatoes, and as we've mentioned many times before, that's where a lot of diseases get their start. Now, Alan has pruned these tomatoes to make sure that he gets a nice big cluster of fruit early on, and the way he has done that is he started down near the soil line and removed, snapped off or cut off any suckers or side shoots that are growing along the tomato vine, so he has one single trunk. And then just below the first cluster, he's left only one side shoot. And so he's got a nice cluster of fruit that's going to get started here. The most energy that's going to go into this plant is going to go into fruit production and not so much into side shoots. Now in contrast, over in our more traditional planting, these tomatoes were planted about 6 weeks later than those tomatoes over there. and they really are still quite small. One helper with rainy weather is that Alan did hill these up on slightly raised mounded rows, and he put black plastic on them, and that's probably helped keep the soil a little bit warmer. However, they are showing some signs of the effects of chilling temperatures. One thing you want to watch for on tomatoes right now is that you might notice that the stems and the foliage is more purple than normal. Now traditionally, that's a symptom of phosphorus deficiency on tomatoes, peppers, and warm season plants. And in essence, that is what's happening here because the soil temperatures have been so cool. The answer, though, is not to fertilize the plants. There's plenty of fertilizer in the soil, it's just not being taken up due to cold temperatures. It's really a waiting game in essence. You just have to wait for the temperatures to warm up, and these will look green again and lose some of that purple coloring. I want you to notice how yellow some of these peppers are. Yellowing is another sign of cool temperature effects on warm season plants. Now the peppers that are over in this row that has subclover sown are even slightly more stunted and a little bit yellower than these that are on a raised bed with a little bit of black plastic over them. On back behind me are some squash, and again, squash originated in Central and South America, tropical climates where they're used to warm temperatures, and they're really not growing very well at all right now. Well, it looks like it's the battle between good and evil here in the potato patch. I've been scouting looking for signs of Colorado potato beetle, and I've found one here, sure enough. I haven't seen any signs of the eggs they've been laying. That'd be sort of a taxicab yellow, gelatinous looking egg on the undersides of the leaves. And if you see those, or you see Colorado potato beetles, just a little mechanical control will do the trick. But I've also been finding a lot of ladybugs, and that's a good sign. Lady beetles eat their weight in gold in aphids every day. Their larvae also will eat a lot of aphids, and the one thing you want to be careful about is in a potato patch, a potato beetle larvae and ladybug larvae look a little bit the same, so you don't entirely want to wipe all those out. It may be ladybugs who are eating aphids and doing a lot of good in the garden. But moving on over here, we have a real contrast in growth habit. The potatoes look great. They're doing well, they're loving the cool weather, but look at this okra. It is not happy. And what happened is, this was sown about 3 weeks ago on a raised mound of soil. Should be doing well by Oklahoma standards. It should be up and growing and maybe be about 6 inches tall by now. Now okra is a little slow to germinate in the spring, but this is really stretching things. And again, there's that yellow, there's a little bit of purple between the veins, a sure sign of cool temperatures. Really nothing you can do. We could re-sow this bed, but I think these will probably come out of it and be okay later on. But let's take a look at the corn. It's growing, but also a little bit slow in the cool weather. If you look over here, there's a pretty good stand of it coming up, but the soil's crusted over. It's very wet. It's still too wet to get in here with a rototiller, but one thing you can do with waterlogged soils to help alleviate a bit of the problem brought about by them is just very, very shallowly cultivate around the plants. That does two things for you. That's going to break the crust of soil. It's going to allow air movement in and help those soils warm up a little more quickly, and also help fight any crabgrass that's taking a toehold in around the corn. Even strawberries, which you think would be a no-fail crop, have been affected by the cool, rainy weather. The varieties that are developed for this part of the country aren't meant to grow in extended periods of cool, cloudy cover. Look what's happened. We have very long petiole length on the foliage of the strawberries. Consequently, they have a real heavy, shady canopy, and it can be slim pickings when you're looking for some nice, red, ripe fruit. I have one here, but take a look at those others. The two in the middle of my hand are off-colored. They're ripening unevenly, and usually that's a sign of cool temperatures. Now the one out on the end of my hand also has suffered from lack of pollination, and that will cause a misshapen fruit, sometimes a cat-faced fruit. Every little seed on the outside of a strawberry has an effect on the flesh development on it. And if a strawberry blossom is not fully pollinated, the fruit's going to be misshapen, just like with cucumbers or watermelons or other fruit. Speaking of fruit, let's go over to the orchard and see how the bees have affected that crop as well. This beautiful May Duke variety cherry tree was planted here 8 years ago by Jim Gallett, and he chose it because it's well adapted to Oklahoma, disease resistant, and bears a lot of fruit. However, there's not a great deal of fruit this season. Take a look at these cherries. There's not a heavy fruit set. In fact, some of them have a little bit of cracking. If you look at this one right here. Now, cracking in a cherry is due to heavy rainfall. And whenever you select cherry varieties, particularly sweet cherries, make sure you pick ones that are listed as crack resistant. Part of the reason we don't have much fruit is at the time that this cherry was blooming, again, we had very cool, wet weather. And with all fruit trees, we depend on honeybees for pollination. In fact, that's the case with vegetable crops as well. And the beekeepers have had a hard year with tracheal mites, which is a problem in beehives. Some beekeepers have lost up to 90% of their hives. And if we don't have bees around, we don't get fruit. Well, a neat thing happened at my house last night. I was working in our office and I heard outside the window a humming sound. Went outside and the air was filled with honeybees. They were flying all around, and I watched them for a while, and they slowly settled down on a tree in a large cluster of bees. They were swarming. It's a natural phenomenon that occurs this time of year, and if you have a bee swarm in your backyard, be sure you call a beekeeper. You can reach them by contacting either the fire department or the OSU Extension Office in your county. Both those places keep a list of beekeepers who are happy to get the swarm. Because they've had so many losses in their hives, they're very anxious to come pick up stray swarms. And the swarms are, as I mentioned, a natural phenomenon. What happens is in the spring, the hives get overcrowded. A new queen is made, and she splits off half the population, and they fly to a tree for protection. The scouts go out and look for another place for a hive, and while they're out scouting, the bees just stay clustered around the queen. It's a very safe time to approach bees if you find a bee swarm because they're filled with honey. They fill up with honey for their flight, and it'll last them for a while, and when they're full, they can't bend over to sting you, so they're very docile at that point. Well, I'll tell you what, there are also rewards possibly for calling a beekeeper to get a swarm. Mr. Paul Hammond came to get my bees last night. He was happy to get them, and he gave us a jar of honey, which we were happy to have. I will mention, if bees have colonized a house or barn on your property, beekeepers will also come get those for you, but that's a very labor-intensive job, and they do charge for that service, but they are happy to get the bees. Now, the weather apparently cooperated with us when the peaches and nectarines were in bloom because they have a heavy fruit set this year. If you haven't thinned your peaches and nectarines yet, be sure to do so before it gets any later in the season. The later you wait, the less good it will do. Remember, thinning does two things for your fruit. It helps the remaining fruits size up, and it affects how sweet they'll be at harvest time. Make sure with peaches and nectarines that you space the fruits about one fruit for every 6 to 8 inches on a limb. The same goes for apples. Now, on peach trees, you may be noticing a lot of fruits dropping right now. That's normal with peaches and apples and other fruits this time of year. In apple-producing parts of the country, they call that phenomenon June drop. But it happens in May in Oklahoma. It's a natural case where the tree is shedding part of the fruit load that it can't carry, and it's especially prominent in years where we've had a heavy fruit set. Now, some of the trees I've looked at have had some damaged fruits. If you look at these right here, there could be various things going on. Plum curculio, which is an insect that's similar to the pecan weevil, can cause a crescent-shaped scar on the fruit, and that can cause it to be damaged and fall off. Also, frost damage can cause similar problems on fruit. And these are the ones that you want to rogue out of the tree as you are thinning it and leave the healthy ones. As usual, you want to maintain your regular peach and nectarine spray schedule so that you will not be disappointed when it comes to harvest time later this summer. Let's take another look back at this cherry. It has a wonderful shape to it. And the reason for that is that when Jim planted it, he made sure that he spread the limbs apart. We talk about spreading the limbs on young trees, but it's rare that we see an old tree that's such a good example of it. When we spread limbs apart, we want them to be as horizontal as possible for a wide crotch angle. What that does for you is when we get into windy weather, that's going to be a much stronger union between the limb and the main trunk than a narrow crotch angle such as one on down here. This one over here was done just right, and it's a wonderful example of thinking ahead for the sake of a tree. Well, I'm going to go on over to a young apple tree that we have and show you how to put in a limb spreader, because now's the time to get that little chore done in your own home fruit orchard. Small jobs in the orchard sometimes are hard to remember to do, but once you get them done, it pays off in the long run and makes for less work later on in the life of the tree. Now, this is an Arkansas black variety apple that was planted, I'm guessing, probably around 3 years ago. And it has a pretty nice structure, but the limbs are still at too narrow an angle to bear a heavy crop load later on. Now, some effort has been made to prune the tree right here and force out a side branch going out at a wider angle. And remember, the wider the crotch angle, the stronger that limb will be. But here's a method that everybody ought to be trying in their own home orchard, and that's just to take a board with a notch at either end, or you can buy special limb spreaders for fruit trees, but they're pretty easy to make. And you just wedge that in between the main trunk and the side shoot. And it's just like braces on kids' teeth. It doesn't have to stay on there very long. This will just remain in there probably until late this summer. And we may have to put it back in a time or two if it gets blown out by the wind, but leave it in there, and that will help this angle to set at 45 degrees, and that will make for a much stronger crotch angle versus taking this out and having this grow more and more upright. Another thing that happens when you put a branch at a 45-degree angle on a fruit tree is it balances out the growth habit. It tells the tree that, okay, I am going to grow horizontally and grow a lot of foliage, but also it slows the growth down enough that it encourages more fruiting buds and consequently more fruit. And this is the trick that people who train trees to an espalier method on trellises have used for centuries, that you slow the growth down by controlling the limb angle on the trees. Well, looking on down the trunk of this tree, there's another little chore that you need to remember to do when you're out in the garden. And this tree's had pretty good care on this all this season already, and that is to nip back this growth that's coming up from the rootstock. Now, the graft on this tree is in good shape, but the rootstock is still trying to grow above and beyond it, and that's how you get these little root suckers coming up, and it's a lot of root strength down there pushing on these. If you leave them in place, they'll very rapidly grow up beside the tree and become even harder to control. The small ones like this down here, you can just snap off, and that's really better for the tree and will probably ensure that that one does not grow back. However, when you look over here, these have just been cut with pruners repeatedly, and they keep multiplying and coming back. A lot of peach and apple growers will routinely go through their orchard and they'll just snap those little side shoots off to maintain a healthy trunk and make sure that your graft remains the dominant force on the tree.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.